Welcome, my NCHEA family, Tri-Campus community. We are here for our afternoon session on being Black, male, and educated in the age of COVID-19. I have three prolific brother doctors here with me today. And before we get this conversation jump started, I want to be able to introduce you to them and their work. So I'm just going to do a little synopsis of their bios, because if we wanted to give the whole thing, we'd be here forever. So I'm going to keep it short, sweet, and brief so we can really hear from them to the table today. First off, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Tommy J. Curry, who is the chair of Africana Philosophy and Black Male Studies at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. He's hailing from Scotland today, so I appreciate him being here at 11:30 at night on his time. His research interests are 19th century ethnology, critical race theory, and Black male studies. He is the author of The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, which won the 2018 American Book Award. He is also the editor of the first book series dedicated to the study of Black males, entitled Black Male Studies, a series exploring the paradoxes of racially subjugated males, which is on Temple University Press. So thank you so much, Dr. Curry, for being here with us today. Our second scholar who's joining us on this roundtable discussion is Dr. Javon Johnson, who is the Assistant Professor and Director of African American and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Look at me, I should have done some warm-ups, right? Dr. Johnson's first book, Killing Poetry, Blackness in the Making of Slam and Spoken Word Communities, released out of Rutgers in 2017. Unpacks some of the complicated issues that comprise performance poetry spaces and argues that the truly radical potential in slam and spoken word communities lies not just in proving literary worth, speaking back to power, or even in altering power structures, but instead in imagining and working towards altogether different social relationships. And just last week, his collection of poetry, Ain't Never Not Been Black, was released on Button Poetry. I appreciate you being here with us today, Javon. Dr. AbdiMalik Buul is an innovative, dynamic leader within the San Diego community. You all know him. He's in our county, representing San Diego County. He's an immigrant refugee from Somalia and came to the United States at the age of 5. He grew up in City Heights in Southeast San Diego, and he completed his bachelor's degree from San Diego State University in sociology and a master's degree in education with an emphasis in community-based counseling and social justice, also from San Diego State University. He recently completed his doctorate in educational leadership with an emphasis in educational psychology from the University of Southern California, and is currently serving as assistant professor of counseling and the transfer center director at San Diego City College. My friends, please help me welcome these prolific brother doctors that we have the privilege of being here today with. Now, I know that all of you have definitely been in my corner for a very long time. I'm not going to date myself with the audience and tell you everyone, don't do it, Javon, okay? Because it's been half my lifetime that we've known one another. But I'd love to jumpstart this conversation just by asking each of you a little bit about what your life was like growing up, Black and male, and trying to get through the educational system, because each of you come from very different paths. And I'd love to be able to add a little diversity in our perspective in terms of being Black male and struggling through the educational system. So Tommy, I'd love to start with you, my friend. You hail from the South. Tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in Louisiana.
Yeah, so I'm from the Deep South. I was born in '79. My city still hadn't fully desegregated yet. I don't think there was an idea of an academically gifted or high achieving Black male during the period of time I was coming up in the 1980s. So lots of my white teachers didn't really value the kind of academic curiosity that I had, despite mostly making A's. So a lot of my life was about white teachers telling me that, for example, my skills in reading, my interests were just for show, that I was pretending to be smart to impress some of my white schoolmates. That really didn't have that much of an effect on me because I got a lot of positive messages from home. I was raised with the idea that white people didn't like Black people, that white people would tell Black people things to make them fail. So that gave me kind of a positive reinforcement. But at the same time, going through primary school, junior high, and high school in Louisiana made it extremely difficult to achieve, not because I wasn't achieving, but because of the ways that I was being graded, the ways that behavior was being interpreted, et cetera. I think that it prepared me for a journey in college, because coming back, with that kind of chip on your shoulder, where that white people are going to be obstacles rather than people to assist or at least get out the way, it let me know that there were going to be lots of hatred, lots of attempts for people to sabotage you. And I certainly encountered that all through college. Finished my bachelor's in philosophy, political science, Black studies at Southern Illinois. Went and did my master's at DePaul. Had lots of racist incidents there. People saying that studying critical race theory or Africana philosophy certainly was not philosophy at all. Came back to SIU, finished my PhD coursework in a year because I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. But then even coming out in the real world, you find two things, right? You find the same white people that lots of people claim only exist in the South, running all kind of institutions in the American Academy, right? You see white people who don't like Black people, white people who are not invested in Black thought, actively trying to suppress what Black people say unless it has a very liberal, integrationist, progressive, leftist, feminist tone. On the other hand, right? So I had that problem because I was majorly focused on critical race theory. On the other hand, I started developing an interest in the study of Black men. And by studying Black men and looking into how Black men were treated, not only socially by institutions like police and the criminal justice system, but also intracommunally and in relationship to white women, there was lots of pushback. I broke with the idea that white women are progressive. I suggested that white women were sexually predatory. That's, kind of evinced by the evidence, right? These are the kinds of topics that were taken up. And I found that coming out, discussing these issues was dynamite. So I think that I was prepared for that in the sense that I understood what white people were, growing up. But I think that in the academy, once you get out, you find that nothing really changes. These are not enlightened white people. These are the same white people that would wear Klan robes if they had the chance, right? They found the right tailor. So I think part of the difficulty of coming out as a Black man in the academy is that you have to understand two things. One, people are not very welcoming of you there. You are not going to be the face of diversity that they think of when they're thinking about affirmative action or diversity slots. The second thing is that if you take a position that is not in line with their politics, you're immediately going to be identified as a threat, right? And that means if you talk about Black men, if you break with kind of the liberal Democratic National Platform, any of these things constitute, a breach of the unspoken contract, so to speak. Right. But I think that, I've had resilience. I think I've certainly had a good level of success. But nonetheless, these are the kinds of things that I think threaten Black men in the academy all the way through from primary school to finishing the PhD.
Wow. Javon, you also grew up in the South, but on the West Coast. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in Los Angeles?
It's not the South.
It's not the South. No, to be fair, I think Talib Kweli once quipped, LA is little Alabama. They walk and they talk with a country grammar. Maybe because, look, LA is a very recent city, and the Black folk that lived it, like my grandparents migrated from the South. So it wasn't like, while I didn't grow up in the South, to your credit, my grandfather's from Shreveport, still sounds like he's from Shreveport. Mm-hmm. My whole father's side is from Arkansas, Little Rock to be specific. They come out here and ask where the yard bird at. So, I say all of that to say, there's some South in me, right? But yeah, I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. That's 1980s, 1990s, South Central Los Angeles. So that's the height of that crack epidemic, the height of the gang epidemic, right? And my relationship with the sort of institution of education is very different. Not to say that than Tommy's. Not to counter his or says his is wrong because I can't do that work and don't want to do that work, but rather to say that mine was different. I went to primarily Black schools, taught by primarily Black teachers. I had male Black teachers, women Black teachers. It was wild the amount. I came into understanding my relationship to education with a bunch of teachers who refused to teach the imposed, doctrinated education booklet that they were given by LAUSD to say, this is what you have to do. Like, I know I could count at least 3 of my teachers who got fired for not teaching what LAUSD told them to teach. Meaning to say, for me, education was this sort of process of insurgency, was this process of pushing back, asking what can we take from the system and how do we move forward, recognizing. So from early on, I recognized that the structure was a problem, but that we can somehow be change agents and be sort of, co-opt things while in there, right? This is sort of my introduction to education, right?
Right.
I then graduated. The worst thing that happened to me, I think, in my sort of education in high school was I had a college counselor who didn't believe in me. But because I had, and she, Black woman, but because I had so many brilliant Black teachers who did, I believed in myself, right? I had, they gave us an insane sense of belief in ourselves, right? You knew me as an undergrad, right? There wasn't a thing I didn't think I could do when I was 20.
Correct.
Like I was the shit, right? I say all of that to say that helped me push. Structurally, I know I experienced racism, and I'm not going to sit here and say that I didn't. That would be absurd on every level. I didn't really start to get those really personal in-person exchanges up until the time I got my first tenure track job, interestingly enough, because I went through so much of my education system being taught by and with Black folk. And to quote Zora Neale Hurston, I know all skin folk ain't my kinfolk, but the point is the same. I found kinfolk because I had so many Black folks. You remember when we talked at grad school, you were struggling to find one Black person. I was up there choosing between 12. I was like, which of these 8 I don't want on my committee, right? And so I was able to find my kinfolk, and it made all the difference for me in the academy. And it also showed me ways to co-opt and work against the very structure that I know is working against me. So I was sort of in there.
Wow. Dr. Buul, you have a completely different experience, even though most of your childhood was reared here. You were born in Somalia. Can you tell us a little bit about what your growing up experience was like?
Yeah, absolutely. My, it's interesting. There's several wave of immigrants that come to this country that are African, right? You've got folks that come as international students with a certain level of class, and they go into universities and they just ascend to middle class, upper class jobs. And there's folks that came from civil war and poverty. And so, my parents came here, we came here, I was 5 years old, it was right after the civil war in Somalia. So we literally, had nothing. I remember translating, food stamps and government cheese. And, I remember, translating, the register, this is how much this costs, this is how much we can afford, and then going into school and in City Heights, there's about 70 languages spoken. And so it was like literally this dumping ground, and I want to say Mosh, but it was actually a dumping ground of all these immigrant communities. Southeast Asian, you had you had your Cambodian, your Lao, your Vietnamese, your Thai. You also had, your Sudanese, Somali, Ugandan. You had your Mexican, and you also had your African American. And we had like literally gang wars, kindergarten all the way till high school. So it wasn't just Bloods and Crips for us. It was like literally race and ethnic, wars that we would have. And so we were racialized. I remember sometimes, the Bloods and Crips and all the Africans would have to team up, and put that to the side against other communities. You know what I mean? So it was very, very interesting growing up in this very diverse community and the fear that was embedded in us. And then I remember finally being expelled, and I got expelled because after 9/11, another identity came as a Muslim, right? And so it was,
right.
There was a certain level of othering being a Black man, and then there's another level of othering. And I remember some dude made a joke, called me Abdullah Abu God after the Water Boy, the Adam Sandler movie. And I was like, don't call me that. And then he did call me again. Then, I put work on him. And then, that I got suspended. And then my dad was like, not understanding what happened, was like, hey, why'd you come home? I said, oh, I was doing good, Pops, so I can go home now. And then his boys were a taxi driver. They said, your son's suspended. Ain't nobody coming home for doing good grades. That doesn't happen. That's not the United States education system. So I got another level of whooping when I got home. And that's the moment I kind of started to realize these identities I was forming as a Black man. Kyle got up in gang life for a bit, and I remember I never knew what a SAT was, a PSAT was. I remember coming back from grad night and people talking about which college they're going to go to on the bus. And I'm like, when did y'all apply for college? You know, counselor, just like, you know, Dr. Johnson never met with a counselor, had no hope. And so I just rolled in my next community college next door. And there I met a Black man who ran an NCHEA program, which is an Afrocentric program focused on the African-American experience. And from there, I was able to dial in and tap into my Blackness and be African-centered in my approach. And, you know, I transferred to San Diego State, got my master's, and I actually graduated. I met another Black man. I remember, you know, he was the chief diversity officer at San Diego State, and he just pulled me over and said, "What are you doing?" It's like, "Oh, 08, it's a recession." I was like, "I don't know. I graduated." He's like, "You know, go home, make a sandwich, you know, find a job." He's like, "Have you thought about grad school?" I said, "What's that?" He said, "Come on, man. You know, here's all the different programs. Here's how you." So another Black man took me on that journey to graduate school. And then I ended up in, you know, becoming a counselor because I just failed where the counselors, I just could never connect with a counselor. You know, so my educational journey is not one that's by design, it's actually by default. I just kept falling through the cracks. And then eventually, you know, teaching with you at Southwestern College, one of my students in the NCHEA program, ironically enough, slipped up and called me Dr. Bull. And I said, "Not yet." And she said, "Well, what you waiting for?" I said, "You're right." So let me go apply for this doctorate degree. So then I applied, got into USC, down in South Central, you know, Javon's old hood over there. And being in there, I started to witness a lot of stuff that, you know, Dr. Curry was mentioning. A lot of these professors and these white folk in these, you know, upper elite institutions are not that smart. They're not that bright. And so I started to ask questions and say, well, this doesn't make sense. How is this theory applicable to the students that I teach over here? And when I started to push back on certain things, there were no answers, or that's absent from the framework, I became more content in my identity, kind of relinquished this imposter syndrome that I was engaging in. And that allowed me to tap into my Blackness much, much more. And I can elaborate once we get, you know, cooking over here.
I think that's something that, you know, is a good place to kind of elaborate on in terms of, you know, we've had multiple conversations, you know, among ourselves and individually between you and I, and about, you know, how do we center ourselves within institutions, knowing that they don't necessarily honor our paradigm of thought. Right. And I want to really talk about this because right now, each of our three institutions that are a part of our NCHEA Alliance are focused on how to bring institutional change when it comes to racial justice. We want to create spaces on our campus that actually provide anti-racist and equity-minded practices so that people who come on our campuses, who work on our campuses, who take classes on our campuses, who are part of our staff and our administration, feel as if it's okay to be comfortable in their own skin, right? And I know that it's struggle, you know, we had struggles kind of doing that. How do we create those kind of spaces? What kind of tips and words of advice can you offer to, you know, folks out here who are watching about how they can participate in bringing these type of practices to our campuses? Since I went round table, I'll go back to you, Dr. Curry. What do you think?
I think it's difficult. I think you've had lots of people over the last few years talk about diversity and equity. But the reality of the situation is that these programs usually appeal to the groups that the white majority or white liberals want to see on campus when you're having these kinds of conversations. A lot of times, you know, Black and brown men fall through the cracks in these conversations. They're brought to campuses for athletics, but they're not invested in when we're talking about academics, and we don't create the kinds of climate or the kinds of classes that are going to attract and retain these groups once they get there. Right? And I say that because, you know, when you look at the data, right, we know that, you know, Black and brown men are a real problem in terms of not only entering college, but also being retained by colleges and universities. I think a large part of that, though, is that you get such negativity on campus, not only with the culture shock, because you're dealing with people who hold negative social stereotypes about this group, but you're also dealing with on the professorial level. Right. Most of the theories that you're going to learn in these universities are not going to reaffirm your identity or your experiences in the world. If we think about what's happening right now with Black Lives Matter, there's lots of conversations about Black Lives Matter, but there's no specific attention to groups of young Black and brown men who comprise over 90% of the victims of Black people shot. Now, if you would think of any other movement that we have within the academic space, that would almost be ridiculous. You would never ignore 90% of any kind of population, but that happens to this specific group. So I think that the administrators need to be very, very alert to what kind of curriculum that you're putting in place that actually speaks and reach out to these young Black and brown men. And I think the other thing is that when you're trying to actually change the climate of a campus, you have to think about it from the perspective of who's not there. I think far too often what ends up happening is white people choose the groups they're comfortable with, or the groups they think will mirror their politics. And you have to have Black people and brown folk at the table that's not just there to be the diversity people, but who's actually trying to create a climate that would in many ways make white people uncomfortable. Right? Having conversations about white supremacy, not only having those conversations, but have conversations about what Black, brown empowerment looks like. Right? These are real key parts that don't often get taken up. And that's bigger than just teaching a class on like Black philosophy or Black sociology. This is actually talking about programs, mentorship networks, those kinds of things where Black folks see college as an investment and allows them the same kind of network opportunities that we generally think white people get once they attend university.
Right, absolutely. Dr. Johnson, what would you give? What kind of words of wisdom would you offer?
So I'm honestly not even sure it's possible, right? And I know that's like a crappy answer for most people to hear. Like I get into these conversations with folk, and they're like, "How can we change the system?" And I'm like, I don't know if it's possible. And I think a question that we skip in asking that is the system worth saving, right? Like, do we need some other structure altogether, some other mode of being? And I'm continually inclined to say yes, that the structures that we have, we assume are generally working if we can make tweaks. But we have both statistical evidence and I think anecdotal evidence that suggests otherwise, that tweaks aren't going to do it. That there needs to be, in not even necessarily overhauls, but entirely new ways of conducting and being in these sort of spaces. I'm of the ilk that perhaps we maybe not try to change it, but ask, how might we take from these institutions and build with and amongst and in communities that these institutions exist in? How might we take these resources and use them? And so again, so much of how it is that I've come into my own thinking, my own activism is rooted in this kind of co-opting metaphor, right? Like it's rarely, like if I think about a lot of my sort of beginning, my early sort of growing up, right? My first introduction into politics was not voting. So I don't have this allegiance to voting that everybody has, right? I'm like, you could if you want. But there are other political mechanisms to raise awareness, to move things, to change things. Riots being one of them. Said this before. I actually think that violent protest is a necessary condition of democracy. I know this stuff sounds wild for a lot of people. I say but I say all of that to say the reason I came into that is when Sunjadu shot Natasha Harlins in the back. My aunt picked me up. I forget, I had to be like 8 years old, 9 years old, something like that. So we're going to go protest. If she kills Black people, she can't make money here, period. I don't care what the court said. And I was like, oh, okay. That was my first introduction to politics. So of course, if her story ended there, I said, oh, this political mechanism works. Now, I've seen voting not work many a times, right? But I say all of that to say this, right? Sometimes we have to imagine other structures, and that the answer isn't always, how do I fix this one? If this one is built on my non-existence, then why am I continually investing and building into it and altering it for my non-existence?
Sure. So a reimagining of what the possibilities could be could move us beyond where we're actually at, is what I hear you saying. And that a lot of strategies that often get kind of tossed to the wayside, right, are ones that we may want to pick up and say, how about this? What would the possibilities be if we were to apply some of these strategies? Is that what I hear?
Toss to the wayside because they're too radical, right? Like I'm gonna step outside of this institution to think of another, right? So when folks are saying defund the police, everybody's like, oh my God, that's way too radical. Abolish the police. What are you talking about? That's way too radical. Can we reform again? Despite the fact that we've been reforming for 30, 40 years now, and none of them have ever proven to really work. But reform again. However, when we went into an economic crisis, they defund education. So clearly we can defund institutions. That isn't an issue. Sure. It's which institutions we choose to defund.
Right. Absolutely. Dr. Bull, you and I have had moments where we've had these conversations too about how do we reimagine our approach to the system? How do we move beyond just the singular moment to talk about actually having a movement that is transformative? Like what would you offer to this conversation?
It's interesting looking at both this whole reform versus dismantle approach, or in the era of reimagining. And, I believe that, in my opinion, and I wrote like 3 articles on this past spring, there are aspects that are beneficial to our community in having a Trojan horse like Dr. Curry enter these institutions and challenge dominant theories, right? Because part of learning is also unlearning. Part of being anew is cleansing yourself. So I believe that we have to have intellectuals, we have to have scholars and practitioners in these spaces combating white supremacy and its conglomerates pushing out this intellect. So I believe we need to have this Trojan horse infiltrating these systems and say, not only do I have the same intellectual capacity, I actually have more, plus I can refute your logic and your theories and concepts. Because those concepts and theories, even if we were to rebuild, are still going to be metastasized into those instructors and teachers. We see those HBCUs regurgitating the same type of theologies and theories that are not beneficial to our community. I also see that there's aspects that are not salvageable at all. I think about the Student Success Act here in the community college system, where the intent of the bill, millions of dollars were spent on why Black and brown men are not passing through basic skills courses. They're not, persisting in math and English, and they're spending 6 years in college just taking two courses. And so we rehauled the whole system, spent millions of dollars. What happened? You look at the budgetary aspects of how administrators and faculty utilize that. They didn't hire any Black and brown professors. They didn't stop the curricular trauma that was existing. They didn't, take away some barriers for our Black students. And so when we see that millions of dollars in the legislature was spent on closing this achievement gap, and then all of the recommendations from hiring practices, from decolonizing your curriculum to disrupting, dismantle antiquated, archaic methods of instruction, none of that was implemented. It was just kind of like reassigned time and more white faculty and more whiteness in our curriculum, more white theories. And so I do get people that are like, well, how do we reform to spend millions of dollars and the same results? So is the system actually salvageable? And so for those in the system that are listening to us today, I hope that you can reflect on your 3 Ps, your power, your positionality, and your privilege. Yeah. How are you asserting yourself in that? If you continuously see this hamster wheel of trauma transpiring at our institutions, if you continuously sit on hiring committees and you keep hiring yourselves, if you continuously keep cutting from these Black programs and Chicano studies and Black studies, if you continuously, are perpetuating this racism, then we have a problem. And lastly, I'll offer this, is that even the terminology we utilize, we have to have the inverse. Like, why do you have diversity, equity, and inclusion? What's the opposite of inclusion? Exclusion. There's exclusionary practice occurring at your institution. What are you excluding? What's the opposite of equity? Injustice. What are the injustices that are transpiring? Opposite of diversity, whiteness. That's the opposite of diversity. We're not going to say it's whiteness. So imagine if we had a anti-whiteness, anti-injustice, non-exclusionary practice training. It takes on a whole level of interrogation, not just inquiry that needs for us to kind of process and assess. So I think that's where we kind of have to move beyond the pale and really push on an extreme understanding and reimagining of these systems.
No, I feel that, especially those 3 Ps, right? The power, the position, and our privilege. And I know that there are some folks who are watching who are thinking like, each of us have caught here. We all have doctorates, right? We all have tenured jobs on our institutions. We all are, we have positions, we have power, we have privilege. So how are we using that to give back to our young Black folk who actually are at our institutions? What ways are we actually activating our own power, our own position, our own privilege to help create space for, the brothers and the sisters who are coming up in these institutions now? And I'll go backwards this time, and I'll ask you, Dr. Bull, to start with this one.
I actually work with an organization called the MEND. I just got off a webinar this morning, and we have about 70 young Black mentees, Black male mentees that we follow from the community college level all the way to the university. So, and they transfer, but we just all the way. And in that mentorship, we offer scholarships and a whole bunch of other things. But I've realized when we do these mental health sessions, we check in the level of trauma, racialized trauma that our young Black men have been exposed to and never had the ability to cope or even heal. Forget healing, they haven't had the ability to cope with. Is so problematic. And these institutions that we're at continuously inflict that trauma. And so I'll give you an example. I remember in January, I saw 2 young Black men trying to enroll at a college. And they just came from the DMV and they had that paper, the paper ID, the license they give you, not the full-on license, but the actual license. 18. Yeah.
The temporary.
So they had the paper. Yeah, temporary one. So they're walking in and I saw them leaving by the elevator. I said, what's going on, guys? Acknowledging. They're like, yeah, man, I guess I can't go to college. I said, what happened? They're like, oh, they wouldn't accept my form of ID, so I'm not sure if I'm not sure if I'm meant for this thing. Like that level of like neglect, dismissal. So when you talk about power, that admissions officer that rejected that person's ID just devalued and dismissed this guy's, like, destroyed his, self-confidence and self-worth. And then you look at K through 12 of that consistently. And so the power they even had just to even show up to these institutions just to try to change his life and his trajectory is deeply problematic. So I say that, we have to, assert ourselves in these spaces unapologetically. I remember that, I started to grapple with this idea, am I radical? People are saying you're revolutionary. I was like, hold up. I'm saying don't be oppressive. I'm saying don't be unjust. How is that like problematic? How's that like revolution? How's that radical? No, I'm at an anti-Black institution, so I have to remove that veil off myself and say, the institution is the problem. You're anti-Black. So we have to, everyone in this webinar today, admit that we work at a racist institution and that you have 2 options, right? You can either acquiesce and assimilate and perpetuate it, or you can actively dismantle, disrupt, and change it from within. That's the 2 options that you have. That's the binary choice. So if you're going to come in here and acquiesce into that and regurgitate what you've been taught and not decolonize and cleanse yourself of this destructive, pedagogy, this destructive curriculum, this destructive engagement with our Black men, then you're no different than an agent of white supremacy at the institution. And that's why we have the preschool to prison pipeline. We have Karens in the classroom. Like people are not going to admit that. Well, that should be a book that I want to write, bursting the preschool to prison pipeline with Karens in the classroom. So we have this K-12, preschool to prison pipeline that we're actually an expressway that we're conducting. And I think there has to be a moment in reality that we have to say, hey, what is my, again, power, positionality, and privilege, and how can I disrupt, dismantle, and decolonize myself from the academy?
Absolutely. Dr. Johnson, we've been knowing each other a long time.
Yeah, so repeat that question again for me. I want to make sure.
I want to know a little bit more about how you've been able to activate your power, your positionality, and privilege to be able to cause change in the young lives of, Black and brown brothers and sisters who are coming through the system right now. And I know 3-time National Slam Poet, I'm gonna give you your props that you have done a lot of mentoring within the slam poetry community, as well as within the academy. I'd love to hear some feedback on how you have activated your advocacy.
Yeah, so again, with my theme of trying my best to co-opt, right? I'll sort of work backwards. Most recently, right? As activists begin to force people to ask questions around global anti-Blackness, right? As we begin to topple various statues around the world, really, and not just the country, that are remnants of our colonial, both past and present, right? As these things begin to happen around the country, universities, of course, are scrambling to ask, and colleges are scrambling to ask, what can we do? I said, oh, you want to do something? Okay, great. And this is a moment that the university can't say no to me. I recognize that. I mean, they can, and they do, but they can't do it the way they did it in the past. So I need X amount of thousands of dollars for my program, provost. I was granted because he don't want to look like the racist white guy who said no in this moment, right? That's just programmatic. Then we're creating a thing called the Rift Lab that is not just for the university, but it's to, again, divert funds away from the university to have a reading and activist group within the community. So when the world opens back up, we'll be renting out community spaces in Black and brown neighborhoods throughout Las Vegas, which essentially takes university funds and fund those other programs throughout the community. How can I help you and help us in exchange, right? So it's really a lot of that. But on direct mentoring, and part of it is a lot of what my brother Dr. Bull just said, in the sense of connecting. The amount of work connecting with someone does is really amazing. It is real ass work. It's real work, right? So, my Black students know they can come knock on my door when I'm in the office. They know that when I'm not there, I'm not there. They know that. But when I am there, I'm fully present. I'm there. They know this, right? Right now, I have worked to get my college to recognize that recognized service labor that minoritized faculty, particularly Black and brown faculty, often has to do, that doesn't count for tenure. So how then do we reimagine tenure structures that imagine Black people to be in the institution to begin with, so that we can take into account other modes of being as professors, right? I have staff on campus emailing me, asking me what should I do about racist incidents. So all of these things fall to my lap as the director of this program, right? I'm certainly not the only one. I don't want to sit here and act like I'm Jesus or nothing like that, but or anything. I'm not the second coming or nothing like that. But it's to say, so much of what I do in the institution is ask, what do y'all have, and how can I use it for them over there?
Sure. Absolutely. But look, Dr. Curry, you spent several years out at Texas A&M, and we know that some institutions are not trying to actually give you money to invest in, the communities and the populations, the DI, the disproportionately impacted populations that really deserve to have that kind of intentional budgeting dedicated towards them. So much that it motivated you to go out to Scotland and start your own kind of program out there focusing on Black male studies. Like, help us to understand a little bit about what you're doing out there and how that's impacting us.
Well, let me start off at Texas. I mean, Texas is basically clan country. And I think, Texas A&M is basically a headquarters. So what I had to figure out there is, how do I move Black and brown students into graduate programs in philosophy and actually see them through. So even though I was only there for 9 years, we graduated about 7 Black or brown graduate students. This is something that never happened in the history of the institution. And that was me actively going into the boxes, picking out people I thought were interesting, making cases for them. There's been many times there where on graduate committee votes, people were ready to cast a person aside. And I was like, look, this sister's a Latina. She has a really interesting story, really interesting research interest. Why don't we take another look? So it's that kind of intervention. And this is me as the only Black person in the department. So that's the first kind of thing. You have to actively try to disrupt the votes, disrupt whatever they think is democratic processes, which are basically just white people having a meeting before the meeting, right? I found that happens all the time. That department meetings really aren't about democratic processes where people decide what happens for the good of the department. This is where friends call people up, try to get votes, and then push their agenda through. The second thing is that when you're dealing with overtly hostile white people, there's 2 things that you have to keep in mind. 1, how you react to that racism, and 2, how they think you react to that racism. So a lot of the people at Texas A&M come from up north, and the racism deeply psychologically affected them. It affected their self-worth. It affected the way they interacted with people, and it affected how they saw themselves and did their jobs, right? The other thing is, white people get a sick pleasure in being able to discourage Black people from achieving their goals. So part of seeing how, making sure that they don't see what they think they want to see, which is a Black person failing, is still control the things and the resources you have there, right? You're always going to have to pick and choose the resource, pick and choose your battles. But the thing is to be relentless, to constantly push for the things and try to push to serve the people that you think should be served. Now, the effect of that at a place like A&M was that even though I was tremendously successful, and in fact, I think one of the program reviews said we had the second most diverse graduate program in the country. And that's just with me there, Mike, right? The consequence of that, however, is that it upsets white people. So there's this kind of critical mass that happens when Black people start making things too Black. And then white people start becoming the racists that we all knew they were and that they know they love, right? And when that moment happens, you have to be able to cut ties. And so I came to Scotland
But wait, Tommy, before you actually start talking about,
Yeah.
Scotland, because I know us in this room, we understand what that narrative was like. Can you just give us a very brief synopsis of the type of death threats that you were getting from the community, the ways in which your institution sold you out and encouraged you to go away? Because I don't want my audience out here to think that we just up here calling white people out and there's no space for white solidarity, because there is. But also we have to honor our very real experiences of being kind of left hanging out to dry by our institution, right?
Yeah.
So just a little bit of backstory on that.
I'll be happy
awesome.
to. Look, I mean, one of the things that happened is, I think it was in May, when I a few weeks before I got attacked by the alt-right at Texas A&M, I had produced a document documenting like 6 or 7 years of racist discrimination in the philosophy department. So I hand this document into the dean of faculties. Don't hear anything, but the next week, people, Tucker Carlson's calling me, asking me to come on the show. I was like, that's a no-go just because I don't like you. Then I start getting death threats. So then I find out that I'm going viral. And allegedly, and I don't know what it's for. I was like, God, I haven't said anything in years. At this point, I kind of calmed down. I'm doing my own thing. So they dug up a clip from when I was talking about Jamie Foxx's movie Django. And Jamie Foxx was being crucified years ago because he came out and said that how black it was for Django to kill the slavers, etc. And I did a short clip defending Jamie Foxx, saying, look, slave revolts, rebellion, resistance, shooting white people were sometimes necessary so that black people could get freedom. And I made the comment that we have a long history of black people believing that the only way they could get free is if some white people die. So this white supremacist, Rod Dreher, pulls this segment out, takes only that sentence, doesn't look at the context, and tries to spread around and says, look, this is white genocide, right? So the white university, good old Texas A&M, true to its color and creed, tries to disown that. So it doesn't really back my free speech, but it tries to say that this was, in fact, inflammatory, that I was, dishonoring the Aggie Code of Conduct, which is laughable, given that they invited Richard Spencer there and they carry guns, but, who's counting? But they go back into this narrative like this is some dangerous militant rhetoric, right? So part of my issue, I ended up staying there. I was full professor. I got full professor that same year, but I didn't trust the institution. I think that is ridiculous in the sense that you have a university administration siding with known white supremacists and alt-right people. And the climate was just untenable, right? I didn't feel like I could get anything done. It's clear the administration wanted me gone. I wanted to leave. So I applied for this position here in Edinburgh. And what was fascinating here is that ancient universities in the UK have long had a race problem, right? In a sense, they're extremely elitist, they're extremely class-based, and very few black people get in. They certainly don't get in at the level of professor or holding personal chairs. But what I have found here, unlike in the United States, is a different kind of openness to the conversation about race. And I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily better, but it's less hostile. Right. So in America, when white people don't like black people, guns, death threats, those types of things follow. Here, it's a question of how do black people get into these institutions and get up the upper ranks. So that is still a very real problem because this is very much a segregated system. But here I'm able to do some different things. Like I'm able to have a platform in Europe that allows me to talk specifically about the pain and the suffering of black people in the United States. The other thing that's different here is that Europeans are not hostile to black male experience. So I'm able to articulate the specific kind of things that affect black men, like the disproportionate incarceration, like the removal from society, like being killed by the police. And people are not offended by that. They're actually interested in how this experience, say, differs than a black woman's experience, right? And right. They give you certain kind of resources that allow you to start bringing black people in. So even though I've only been here a year, within the first, I say 6 months, we had already admitted our first black graduate student in philosophy to study black nationalism and black male studies. Now that's 6 months. In the United States, that took me several years. So I think that the important part to understand here is that, look, we do all work in racist institutions. That's not going to change. Now, if we all want to burn them down, I'm down for that plan as well. Like if they're going to go away, you're not going to hear, I may save some of the libraries, but other than that, I'm good. Let me get my stuff out of my office. But the important part, though,
that's another fact. Don't gloss over that. Let me get my stuff out.
Exactly, that's all I'm saying. But the part about that though is being in these kinds of positions, right? And I mean, and I want to be very specific here. Being in the position of being at the University of Edinburgh and the first black philosopher ever be hired at the birthplace of enlightenment does do something if universities have to stick around and we're trying to get people into this place.
Absolutely.
Right. And I don't want to underestimate that, right? Because as much as I want to see things that don't work disappear, and in many cases, depending on the day, I think that those things that don't work are white people. We have to be mindful that there are still accumulations, institutions of power. And I think that one of the mistakes that we make right now in how we're discussing this moment with BLM, COVID, institution, divestment, et cetera, is that we're not tracking power. We're tracking positions, we're tracking jobs, we're tracking discourse, but we're not tracking power. The people who run the institutions, who are making the financial decisions, and who are deciding which people get higher when as a response to the crisis. And I think that even when we have these other kind of revolutionary politics, we also have to ask the very real structural questions. And I've seen a resistance to doing that because we're too worried about social media, public intellectual celebrity profile, and who's feeding into the DNC.
Go
ahead.
If I may, I want to just piggyback off what Dr. Curry mentioned. The analysis of power has got to be instrumental. And it's uppercase power, lowercase power stuff. It depends, right? And so part of it is, I teach in this restorative justice program at San Diego State for future master students who are going to become counselors, right? And when the whole defunding the police came out, and people were saying, we want to, defund the police, in response to mental health crisis. And Alfred Alongo, shot here in San Diego, was a mental health case. He was having a psychotic episode, and when the police came over, because he was going through his episode, he started to mimic what they were doing and put out his finger and like a gun, and they shot and killed him. And so I challenged my students. We've got 92 plus students in here. And I said, people are out in the streets right now saying that they want to replace you, less cops, more counselors. They want more of you to handle that work. Are you prepared for that? Are you adequately prepared for that? And the level of fear, the level of trepidation, the level of uncertainty that came about that discussion, the level of racism and white supremacy that was just like unfolding was truly problematic, that I don't even think that we have the capacity in certain aspects to replenish these institutions. And so the power that I'm trying to assert myself is, okay, I'm a counselor here. I'm training counselors at this level. I'm going to work at the community college because 86% of Black males in California enter higher education, post-secondary education through the community college system. This is ground zero. So as a Black man with a doctorate degree, I'm going to be at ground zero. But I also get to train future counselors that are going to impact these Black males. And so how then do we start to leverage ourselves, replicate ourselves, and have a widening impact in that analysis of power is important, not just within ourselves, but our thought, our ideas, our concepts, and pushing that and creating this change. So one last thing I told these students, I said, I believe, it's my firm belief, that a gangster on the block is more committed to his neighborhood than a white police officer that lived in the suburbs. And they're like, well, what? I said, let's unpack that. I said, this man has his neighborhood tatted on him. To me, that's commitment to your neighborhood. He's committed to his neighborhood. This man's daughter, he wants her to take her bike to the park and walk back without any violence. He's shopping at the corner store, giving taxes to the community. So I said, this person is more invested in my mind in the community than a white cop who doesn't, live in the community, comes in, patrols, leaves, So who has more commitment to that community's safety? So why don't we just reimagine how we can then galvanize safety, empowering these people? So should we put $80 million in SDPD funding towards, a gang suppression unit? Or should we put $80 million into gang members to say, hey, we know this is your neighborhood, you want to protect it. Here's how that looks like. And so that whole concept of reframing and reimagining how we, think is very, very important.
I think that goes back to some people actually being fearful of what that might look like when you give $80 million to the gangsters on the block, right? And I'm not trying to say that's
no bad neighborhoods. I'll tell you that much.
I get curious because I know that, here we have some similar sentiments, but that's not always the case when, we're talking even just amongst Black folk, right? We carry a lot of intra cultural differences in terms of how we come to these conversations. Black men and Black women don't always stand on the same ground when it comes to looking at some of these, situations. I'm curious about, the type of I want to say lack of, solidarity that might come out of, our conversations. But I really don't think it's that either. I just think it's differences of opinion and how they work against one another. What kind of intra-cultural kind of dynamics are we facing as we look at what's ahead for us? What are some of the issues that we should be, as an in-group, be focusing on before we can actually turn outward and say, here's what we need to do moving forward? I'm not going to pick on anybody, but if anybody has a contribution for that, I would love to hear your thoughts. Jay, please.
I'll jump in to your point. And how do I pronounce your first name, brother? I don't want to butcher it. Is it
AbdiMalik?
AbdiMalik.
Yeah.
AbdiMalik. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to butcher it. But to your point, AbdiMalik, we don't even have to reimagine gangs protecting it. That's literally the history of how they got born, right?
Exactly.
Right. Particularly against white supremacy. Here we got to go back to South Central to think about the guardians, the Slauson, the businessmen who guarded patrol boards because you didn't want to call police because they weren't going to help then, like they don't help now, right? But fantastic, right? Having and part of I could go on a tirade about that, right? This is home for me, right? What you talking about? But and part of that is also this notion if you fund that, what you're funding is the belief that white structures can't get it done, and I don't know how whiteness would ever fund that, right? I don't know, right? I'm trying to think through it, right? But whatever. To your question, Rach, I'll let my colleagues speak on other issues, but I do think some of the things that we have to sort of think through is class. How do I say this? I said this in a less tactful way at one talk, and people was upset. But I'm gonna try to say it more tactful. Negroes with a little bit of money killed me. They often do. I wish I could say otherwise. I'm hearing
is that as we, move up the economic ladder, that we also, take on some different kind of understandings of who
not everybody. Certainly not everyone. I don't want to do that work. Certainly not everyone. I don't want to do that work. But they did. So I'm in this group right now, and I keep asking myself, do I just leave? Because almost every other day, I'm like, these in my own house, I'm going off. They don't know. They've not read a single, and I'm just bothered, right? It's a professional Black group of Las Vegas. And their comments on things are robustly wild. And I'm at a loss. It's do y'all really love us? Because so much of their arguments are around the sort of, they rest on this assumption that Black people are somehow automatically inept. Mm-hmm. Right? I wish we got out and voted as much as we went to get Popeye's chickens out. First off, chicken sandwiches are delicious. Let's just get that out, off the rip. Chicken sandwiches are fantastic. If you're not vegan, of course, right? Or vegetarian. If you're not, they're fantastic. But did we also have the same comment for Starbucks? Do we have the same comment for In-N-Out? Do we have the same comment for Chick-fil-A, which all have lines? Hell, McDonald's have lines, and I don't eat that, but whatever. The point is, there's this desire to go, somehow we're backwards. Y'all are buying Jordans and not buying houses. I was like, oh, show me where a $200 house exists.
Right.
I'll copy you. I'll buy some for everybody. I'll have a Black neighborhood tomorrow.
Right.
Right. But they, or even the passport Twitter. I think about passport Twitter. Y'all niggas don't travel enough. Why are we doing this? Why? So I get so frustrated with our class sort of issues, not recognizing the ways in which class structures are inherently built to exclude. I love Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's claim that capitalism requires what word am I looking for? She didn't use unequalness, but that is what I'm trying to get to. Capitalism.
Disadvantages?
She didn't even use that, but that's what I'm getting to, right? Inequality. Capitalism requires inequality. Racism enshrined it.
Okay.
Right? And if we think through that as a concept, right, then we have to think through our lower class Black folk, our working poor, our downright poor, our homeless, those who need mental, whatever, right? We look at that differently. We don't have the same claims about not good. So those claims for me rest in this assumption that we too can move towards a closer proximity towards whiteness, which I'm not invested in, and I don't care to be invested. But I'll shut up there.
So definitely some class stratifications there in terms of, looking at parts of our group, as being less than because they don't make enough money or because they're choosing to invest their money in ways that we disagree with, right? I mean, I do think that
look, we can critique capitalism till the cows come home. There are some Jordans that are just fresh. I have 2 pairs of 4s in my closet right now. I'm sorry. I know Nike have very troubling capitalistic practices, and we could talk about my own, relationship together. That's worthy, but they go hard. I don't know how to say that.
We're going to get a disagreement from us about the J's in here, right?
I'm an Air Force One person myself.
Karl Marx's analysis was absent of fresh J's for sure. I don't think that was part of the framework.
That's a new commodity for him.
Writes about? Is that not?
Listen, class is definitely one of the issues. I think also gender and sexual orientation are issues that pop up. I hear you, Tommy, over here co-signing with me. Like, help us to understand how these are issues that internally we have to unpack amongst ourselves.
Well, the thing is this: is that I think that the way that we articulate gender issues between Black men and women and other sexual minority groups within our communities is largely framed by the upper classes, right? So the language that we're getting about how we should interpret like homophobia, transphobia, et cetera, in our communities are coming from these theories that are being developed within elite, white institutions and the people that take those kinds of institutions and ideas up, right? And that's why it was not in my head, right? Because if you look at so when you look at middle-class Black people judging other poor Black people, the idea is there's something dysfunctional about them. When you look into the Black Academy, because the majority of the Black Academy are middle-class Black women who identify as feminists in a certain kind of vein, you get theories that demonize poor Black men, right? And those kinds of theories proliferate all the way down for how we interpret violence, how we interpret sexual abuse and assault, and how we interpret general deviance, right? So when we have those conversations, it's important to understand those are class divisions. When you're talking about working class Black people in their own community, we have lots of issues, but we generally don't hate each other. Right? The data does not suggest that. It suggests that in relationships, we hold stereotypes about each other that white people hold, right? Which is why we have all this stuff in Black family psychology, and we have all these issues with how relationships work, et cetera. But in terms of a general practice, and I can't emphasize this enough, Black men and women generally hold positive views of each other. And there is a significant minority that do not. And that significant minority that do not are part of the people that end up having the loudest voice, end up doing the social media talks, end up being the woke division, end up being the people that white liberal America pays attention to. That's not to say that we don't have issues of sexism, homophobia, transphobia in our communities, but the way they interpret that is so far off from what the data and the experiences of Black people actually say that it's almost worth not mentioning, unless we're going to just call it for what it is, which is a lie. So we know things happen in our communities, like early sexual debut. And that happens for Black boys between 9 and 14, happens for Black girls usually between 12 and 16, right? When you're talking about domestic abuse, we have disproportionate rates of domestic abuse, not only unidirectional violence of male to female, but female to male. You talk about child abuse. You pick any kind of relationship in our communities, and it's going to be disproportionately more than white communities, largely because these things vary with class. Right. So the poorer you are, the more exposed you are to unemployment, to alcoholism, to recidivism. These are the kinds of things that are going to creep up in the community across any kind of race. Right. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, why do we have the same issues that every community has? Why do we vary in terms of its incidence, its prevalence, et cetera? But when we talk about these as things, especially in the academy, these become deal breakers. So the assumption here is while we know that there's tons of more people hurting people and killing people, white women are making examples out of white men in white communities, right? Even though these things happen, somehow those communities are still able to function. But the way that it's talked about in our community is that any form of deviance or disproportionate violence is a deal breaker. It means that we have to separate ourselves because we can't understand violence as a function of economics, neighborhood segregation, et cetera, but really of these bad characters that we have. And of those bad characters in our communities, usually it's poor, straight black men who are the most deviant, right? Which is not true. Maybe if you're looking at homicide, but black men in these environments kill other black men, not really other people to the same extent. But the question is, why do we judge our people as fundamentally character flaw? Why are we utilizing racist theories and accounts of criminology to talk about why some members of our community are dangerous to other members of our community, right? Because prevalence does not tell you causality. We don't know what causes it. We just can point to a descriptor of what exists in the community. And I think in order for us to actually deal with this, we have to start having real honest conversations. And what I mean by honest conversations is we have to stop buying into the dominant framing of the media. We have to stop buying into the dominant framing of the people that are talking from institutions and universities that are trying to make sure that we have separation and misrepresenting data and facts to try to get to score a point for their team, right? Black women are victims, but they're not the only victims. Right? Same-sex couples and queer black people are victims. They're not the only victims. Trans people are victims, but they're not the only victims. Until we start having those conversations about the conditions that black people are in that are producing forms of violence, we're going to keep this cycle going, trying to find the most evil black person and separating them out for the rest of the group. And it's an extremely dangerous phenomenon that I think is happening far too often today.
And it's not just cutting across, gender and sexuality, but as you mentioned, Dr. Bull, earlier in this conversation, even our religion, is called into these kind of conversations. I mean, growing up, Black, male, Muslim, I'm curious, how does religion fit into this conversation as well?
It's very interesting, not just religion, but also culture, right? So I had this discussion on a Facebook Live a while back in the summer that there's this African diasporic, African-American intra-discussion that also has to transpire, right? That I remember coming into the States, a lot of my earlier fights and problems were these, as Dr. Curry mentioned, these media depictions of Lion King was the worst thing that could happen to me. Timon, Simba, Mufasa, we was catching fades every single day. You know what I mean? So I appreciate Javon said, how do I pronounce your name? Because it was Rafiki at one point. So we used to catch it all the time. And then I saw brothers that was, fighting as they got to high school was dashiki'd out, African, you know what I mean? What's up, my brother? And I was like, what transpired from you having this inter-hate of this absence of Africa in the African-American name? And so there's this, and then also for us coming here, there's a secret conversation that happens. Don't be like them. They don't have a language, they don't have a culture, and so, this white supremacist notion, again, of Black inferiority for folks that grew up in white supremacy and racism. And so we're hit with these antiquated, archaic, but colonized versions of ourselves to continuously hate on each other, rooted in our identity. And so I experienced a lot of that growing up. And for me, teaching the NCHEA program, I saw the brilliance, the power, the intelligence, the capacity, the potential that folks tapped into when they tapped into their identity, the Africanness, when they're African-centered. And then I got to conceptualize why it was so important to remove Kunta Kinte as a name, what that entailed, right? And just the power of saying, call me, I'll put an X on my name. I'm not going to take this name from you. There was so much power in that. And so there is this intra-hate that we have. Javon mentioned the whole class. I kid you not, every time I meet a Black author, it's probably 2 that I've met in my lifetime, that I'm like, oh, this is a decent human being. When they make it to the academy, I mean, the level of elitism, Lord have mercy. You know what I mean? And so and then, you start to write your own, and you're like, dude, you're not all that anyways, man. So, but there's this elitism that exists that I'm just like, Lord, and these are the people that come on CNN, NBC, that have, all these followers, because they're the people that get the platform, because that is what white supremacy also wants to regurgitate. And so I'm with 100% with Javon, the elitism that we take on. Tommy's 100% right in terms of this compounded oppression, but what we get to, alienate and which we to heighten, right? We're going to talk about this because this is going to help us with this cause, to suppress this cause. And so this crabs in a barrel effect is very, very problematic and is one of the, ABC's toolkits of white supremacy. But I'm more focused on why the hell we're in the barrel anyways. Any crab wants to get the hell out of the barrel. Like, what is the barrel?
You know, I always tell people when they say that metaphor, I'm like, are we going to talk about why the crab is in the barrel in the first place?
Right.
He's going to survive. I'm about to get cooked. By any means necessary, I'm getting out of this joint. You know what I mean? And so my cause is like liberation, you know, emancipating our minds, liberating ourselves from these structures and systems, freeing ourselves. And that's the moment that I felt like when I tapped into my blackness, I was like, okay. No matter how I say it, you're tone policing. My inquiry will always be an interrogation. My confidence will always be arrogance.
Always.
Like no matter what I do, you know, the way I dress, Malcolm, Martin were shot and killed wearing suits and ties. So even how I dress don't matter to you. I can preach nonviolence or I can preach self-defense. It don't matter. So if you wear a hoodie, if you wear a suit and tie, the outcome is going to be the same. And that's the moment where I just kind of like, you know, tapped into my blackness and said, hey, like the system, it is what it is. But you have to have that inner peace within yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's the moment for our community to really reckon with, being content and rooted in who you are, not restricted by who you are. Be rooted in who you are, not restricted by who you are.
Absolutely. I think that right there is the key, is knowing the ground that you stand on, being comfortable standing on that ground, and then also being open enough to still receive ways in which you can grow and elevate, because none of us are stagnant human beings in this chat right here. You know, we still have about 20 minutes in our conversation. At this point, I'd really love it if the audience could just throw out some questions that you would love to hear from our brothers, you know, on this like panel here. If you have some questions, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll come back and we'll be able to unpack some of those questions there. But while we're waiting on those questions to come in, you know, I'd really like to kind of fast forward into this specific moment right now. COVID-19, George Floyd. Right. We're about to be, you know, in this presidency. November 3rd is rapidly like coming, you know, forward. And I'm just curious, like, you know, Brother Doc's out there right now. Like, how has how has this moment accelerated the type of work that you're doing right now? Because like I said, I put a live chat out there earlier to the group here and said, we have a little bit of a delay because they're keeping us busy. Javon was coming in from another session. I think you said you had 3 sessions today, you know, calling, you know, talking about these exact same issues. So, you know, how has this particular moment just elevated your advocacy? And I'll start with you, Javon, since I already put you on the table there.
Yeah, like you said, Rach, like, on some level, it's maybe busier, and interestingly enough, expanded my own sort of intellectual wheelhouse, right? Folks say, oh, you're Black, you can talk about this. And if I've read a little bit, then, you know, maybe it's time for me to read more. Maybe it's time for me to bone up and get ideas on more, right? So like, I know a lot about the police. I know a lot about the history of how they came to be. I know about how they function. But I never really, so earlier today, I was talking about the militarization of the police. So I said, let me dig into this even more, right? And I'm finding now I got to know a whole lot more about the Philippine-American War in order to talk about the militarization of the police. That the tactics that the father of modern policing, August Vollmer, brings as the first police chief of Berkeley, who also then goes down to LAPD, who also helps what we know as criminal justice and criminology gets born, were direct tactics he learned while fighting in the Philippine-American War, fighting against insurgents in mountainsides and things like that. So it's no wonder then that the police looks like a lot like that. But whatever, right? It helps me learn a lot more, right? And now I'm like, I need to learn a lot more about those tactics to see how they mirror now, right? So that we can talk about this, we can unearth this stuff. But it's made me busier. I will say too, the kind of person that I am, and I'm gonna come around by way of saying this. So I'm at a conference, well-known academic friend of mine comes up to me and they're like, I love your affect in these conferences. I was like, what do you mean? They go, you just walk around like none of this affects you. Everybody's so high strung. I go, it don't. My identity isn't here. It's a job. It's a job that a lot of I do like, because I like to read. I like to talk ideas. I'm curious. I want to be challenged. I want to be told I'm wrong and how. I want to tell you you're right and why I think, like, I want that. Like, I live for this, even when it's not what I believe to be true. So I love this, right? And I say all of that to say, I still don't make this my identity. My identity is when I go home and my niece and nephews lose their minds because uncle came home, right? And so I say all of that to say a lot of what has happened is me stepping back and trying to now reckon with my relationship with the academy and what that means. Mainly because I have found myself to be such a happier person sitting at home, gardening, woodworking, just reading what I want to read, talking to friends about ideas in ways that aren't necessarily structured like the institution will have them structured. But still getting to talk ideas, but digging in the dirt and getting my hands dirty, like my cousins and them from Arkansas, like my folks from back south, right? Shout out to Tommy, right? But thinking about like so now I'm at this place of reckoning. What does that mean, right? And certainly, you know, part of how I deal with that is thinking about it as a job, right? It is a job. And at the end of the day, how do I want to sort of relate to capitalism and how don't I want to relate to capitalism? And how do I push back against white supremacist structures that tell me that this is the only way to be, right? And so I've been busier, yes, because I'll do talks, I'll do these things, I love them, and because it's Zoom oriented, people want to do a million of them, and so there's a million more of these to do. But I've also been freer in a lot of ways, and have been able to do things that I want to do because of this. Even though I do miss the in-person dialogue desperately, I miss being able to sit in a room. When I was in the Bay Area, I used to have this group of young Black high school age boys and college age Black men where we talked. I miss that desperately, like just to be able to be in a room, like, how you doing, brother? You know? And so yeah, I've been busier, but I've also been freer and happier because I'm not having to go to my university on a regular basis. But yeah, I'll stop there.
You know, it's interesting because I know that, Tommy, you've taken a little bit of a different direction too with, you know, COVID and, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, and actually gone back to the academy to kind of study public health. Can you talk a little bit about what encouraged you to actually do that?
I'm tired of people who lie about Black people getting platforms to do so. You know, let me tell you something that profoundly affected me about this question. When I started studying the Holocaust, I started interacting with Holocaust studies and people who are running, you know, like the Virtual History Archive at USC. And one of the things that happened was, you know, I asked this question. I was like, well, look, how do you explain the kind of violence that you see Jewish men engaging against Jewish women, or Jewish women engaging against Jewish boys and men during the Holocaust? I was like, do you ask those questions? And, you know, one of the scholars there told me, he's like, you know, when our people's lives are in jeopardy and they're put in such harsh conditions, we wouldn't dare think that that's who they are, given how they act under those circumstances. And that statement, he told me this almost 4 years ago now. It stuck with me because out of all the people that interpret their own people around the world, Black people, specifically in America, are the only people who claim that how Black people act in the most terrible conditions of poverty, incarceration, oppression, etc., that somehow defines their actual character and essence. So part of the reason I went back to get my degree in public health and epidemiology is because I'm interested in actually tracking intra-racial violence. I am sick and tired of people with degrees in English trying to tell us what the actual psychology and the motivations of Black people's behaviors are in our neighborhoods. I am sick and tired of people who have the views that Black men are evil, that Black people are incompetent, that the minute that Black men want to imitate white men's masculinity, having the forefront, be on the forefront and giving the platforms to lecture to the Black community as if they're children, right? Part of the issue with us being in the academy, and especially the work that's going on now, is for us to figure out why we're suffering and why we're dying, right? We can march and say her name all day, but the bottom line is even if you save every Black woman who's killed, that is not going to stop the other 200 and 300 Black men that are killed. So we need to actually have a very real conversation about what is motivating and activating threat construction in the minds of white people, what's allowing these things to go unchecked in our communities. How do we build up teams of lawyers that are going to overthrow Graham versus Connor, right? These are the kinds of questions that we need to talk about. And unfortunately, we can't always do that with the kinds of intellectual and theoretical bravado. We have to get our hands dirty, go into our community, start actually testing things, and start recommending policies to do that. Now, the revolution comes tomorrow. That's fine too. But at the same time, though, what we're dealing with is the trauma and the tragedy of loss that we're seeing every day, right? We saw Mr. Floyd be murdered on live TV in broad daylight, and that murder that everybody's jumping up and down about as protest was broadcast. So regardless of what we think the effect of that was, the world saw, the world watched, the world was attending to literally seeing the life come out of a black man in the 21st century. It was a public lynching. And regardless of how we say we may react to that, the reality of the fact is it was both expected and it was tolerated because we watched it, right? And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in how is it that in the 21st century in alleged democracies where black people have all these celebrity black intellectuals claiming they're doing the good work for black people and vying for political parties and positions in the Democratic National Party, how it is that all our black people keep suffering. Why are black men the one dying? Why are black men the ones still being incarcerated at these crazy numbers? We need answers to that. So public health for me was a way to try to get concrete answers beyond kind of the theoretical interventions I was making as a philosopher. And it means that we have to start re-engaging our communities, not with the types of theories that we learned from the academy, not with our biased gender feminist lens that tells us that everybody who is not a woman is somehow less conservative or more conservative. We need to get hands down and start looking at how black people, working class, lower middle class black people are actually living and trying to figure out what we can concretely do to eliminate violence in that. We have to stop defining ourselves within the tragedies of American racism. Right, we have to insist on new definitions, and we have to insist that the people who get platforms to talk about us are making sure they utilize new perspectives and paradigms to interpret our realities.
You know, and I also think that in our conversations, we've talked about how public health leads directly to policy making, right? And policies that, you know, we can help to produce that actually function on our behalf. And I know, Dr. Buul, you've been out there like gathering us up, you know, across the state to be able to say, how do we directly speak to the type of policies that are out there? Like, can you just share, you know, a few words with us? I know we have some questions coming into the chat, but I'm curious about, you know, the policy making work that you're trying to help us like come to understand.
Yeah, it's just going back to that analysis of power and then knowing that, you know, at what point do we have critical mass, right? At what point do we have X amount of black people in the institution, in various positions, administrators, faculty, staff, students, you know, and at what point do we enact that agency and activate ourselves? At what point does the Trojan horse, do we just burst that open? And really looking at that. And so we've been able to establish something called the Village Demands. And that was really in several black organizations, prominent folks, all over the community college system, you know, 115 colleges. It's the largest, you know, second largest institution in the nation, 2.1 million students. And so part of that is just looking at the power that we have and mobilizing ourselves. So we have a policy, we have education task force, we have a, you know, curriculum institute. Is really also looking at disrupting aspects and dismantling aspects of the institutions that are not beneficial to us. The other thing that I'm hearing folks talk about is, yeah, we're much more busier. Like I have like 7 presentations this week, and I'm getting pulled into like, you know, preschool had a virtual bad hair day, and you know, microaggressions against young black girls, and so then come and, you know, educate us on anti-racism work, and then I'm going to these white, you know, corporations that are. It's interesting. Like people that have been contacting me are people that are tired of the regular DEI work. There's people out there repackaging diversity, equity, inclusion work as anti-racism work. Saying, here's a new framework, right? And people are tired of microaggression. Like what happened to George Floyd wasn't a microaggression. You know, like that was torture. Like I'm from Africa. Like the lion and the predator, the cheetah, the lion, had more mercy than the police officer, because the lion will snap the gazelle's neck so it doesn't feel pain. It'll kill you instantly. To kill someone, to torture someone for that long, it's just so brutal. Like even I can't even say it's, you know, it's inhumane. I can't say it's, you know, an animal. No, animals don't even do that. Predators don't even do that. And so that tapped to certain people's, I think, consciousness. That level of brutality, similar to Emmett Till's mother showing that open casket, that people are now, I think, more amped to do that. And then I'm also cognizant of what Javon mentioned about the black tax. Like we are continuously and constantly everything black. Can you talk everything black? So I'm having to practice self-care. Like we can't be wounded healers healing people when we're wounded ourselves. And so how does self-care look like? So I'm having to start, and that's great. Is that embedded into my job description? No, fall back. You know what I mean? Companies saying, you know what, we're creating an equity task force. I'm like, what do you want? Oh, we want black people. We want to hear their voices. Is that part of their job description? Are you taking something else off their load? Do you know the racialized trauma they're experiencing? If it's not baked, are you giving them extra stipends for that? No, then you're overburdening the choir.
I'm sorry to cut into you. I was going to say look, I'm on 2 committees. They was like, I need funds for that work. Otherwise, Javon is going to be at home.
Yeah.
I get chilling.
No, facts.
Yeah,
facts.
like
even the mental thinking, Javon.
It's not like, so when the university went from analog to digital, which was a rapid shift, right? It was a pretty rapid shift to very, a computer room to a smart campus, right? They found millions of dollars quickly. The same millions that they keep telling us they don't have when we ask for departments and programs funded. Then B, they also, many of them paid departments, created entirely new departments and paid the folks who were teaching in these sort of computer departments already on campus. They paid them for that work. So if you want some diversity work and you need my Black diversity self to do it, you just said you need work. So I would like to be paid for it under the capitalism.
That's the way capitalism works, right?
Yeah, if that's the
Black labor matters, though. Like black labor matters,
right? That is serious in moments like this. Mm-hmm.
No, right. The other piece that I was gonna say, look, I keep thinking about DEI as a term, and it's the all lives matter approach to this. Like, well, I hate that term, but yeah, I'm gonna
expand on it because the people repackaging that. It's very, very important.
I want you to know that this is exactly what the chat wants to know, right? That we've had a couple questions come up, and I appreciate you, Donna. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna read your commentary here so that the panel can kind of help shed some light on this. Donna says, "Thank you all for this extraordinary panel. As a white woman and instructor, I need to hear from the Black men, young and old, students and non-students who are struggling to survive. Without hearing their truth, how can I know what role I can play in transforming the system as an educator? Where and how do I hear these stories directly, upfront, personal, and in real time? And why am I afraid that asking this is an inappropriate question?" And I'm gonna give my brother Bruce, Dr. Bruce Hoskins at Maricosta, some props for chiming in here, who he said, that's not an inappropriate question. It's not, Donna. However, the answer is simple. You need more Black friends, real ones, people that feel comfortable inviting you over to their house and breaking bread with you. Just be there in the community and conversations will come up. And I'm curious about, what do we tell our white, allies, our white accomplices who do want to do the work, right? Who do want to understand what role that they can actually play in this current moment? Because people are asking, how can I change? Do we have any kind of strategies that we can offer?
Well, I don't know. Just like to create racism. That's one. I think also too, if Black folk don't want to tell you their stories, that's their business. They don't want to tell you their story. They don't have to. And you got to recognize that allyship is hard work at times, right? Like I personally feel like I've had white colleagues ask me this. My students don't share. Ask yourself why. Do some self-work. I don't know. They share with me, so that I don't know what to tell you. Like sometimes it's okay to just not get, I don't know, the narrative. I'll let my colleagues.
Well, look, I'm very skeptical of the whole allyship. I don't, I'm not a fan of it. I don't think it's possible, but but that's not to say that you can't do concrete things, right? So the first thing is you need to understand Black men and boys. Okay, so there are actual books based in research. So don't go to bell hooks or the people that follow bell hooks. Go read books with citations that do studies on Black men and boys that are written by people that are Black men that have degrees in psychology, philosophy, sociology, etc. That's the first thing. The second thing is understand the position that you have as a white woman. So don't try to get yourself off the hook. White women have historically been destructive to Black men and boys. They hold negative stereotypes about them. They usually don't believe in their academic and intellectual capacity. They often prefer their female counterparts to them, and they share in this message with Black parents, right? So part of the work that you have to do in trying to heal this process of anti-Black misandry is to understand that the very idea and how you're evaluating Black men and boys in your presence is already probably racist and has some kind of misandric characterization about their felon. The third thing you can do is that once you understand that as the basis and understand the long history you've had with triggering patriarchal violence and lethal violence against them, is to actually take a constructive and positive role in redesigning how you're evaluating them. That doesn't mean that you're lessening the criteria. It means how are you actively interpreting what you take to be failure, misbehavior, as well as giftedness in their presence. And once you do that kind of work, then you can start thinking about how you relate to Black people, specifically Black men, on a larger scale. Because you have to understand that for the most part, white women have utilized the idea of sexism, the idea of being frightened, as a way to trigger white men to protect them from people that look like the Black men and boys that you're claiming that you want to help. Now, that is a very real political and intellectual exercise. And that means that you have to come in grips with yourself to understand why Black people, and especially Black men, are not going to trust you, right? Because their lives depend on the fact that they have a certain distance from you and that you don't say anything about them. And if you're serious about that, that's something that you can endeavor. But don't expect to be invited in to certain kind of community spaces, because you do exist in a very real way as an enemy, right? When they're thinking about the white women that's making phone calls, making up issues about Black men in New York and California, et cetera. Right, just trying to watch the board, because white women have historically policed the proxemics of white supremacy, meaning that you knew that a Black man was getting too close when a white woman got nervous, right? So you have to understand that role that you play in that, and you have to actively work to deconstruct that, especially since you're in the role as a teacher, right?
Donna, thank you so much. I know that this is like, Tommy don't look, no chaser. He's gonna give it to you straight, no chaser. And I hope that, like, you know, when we hear this type of like truth, that we do internalize it, because it is highly uncomfortable to understand kind of the historical, you know, space that we come to arrive in this particular moment. But like, these are the steps and the measurements that we need to actually take to be able to get to that next level that we want to get to. So I really do appreciate you taking the courage to write your question in the chat. You know, I also want to ask, you know, one of another professor, you know, out there, Katrina Taylor, asked about how do we start to have these conversations within HBCUs, right? How do we start to dismantle these same type of like institutionalized racist practices that become challenges and barriers in spaces that were designed to actually like uplift us as Black people? Anybody want to chime in on that?
I don't know.
I think those two are connected.
That's my wheelhouse. Go ahead, y'all. Get in there.
You know, it's interesting. Every year I would take, Doc, you remember this, we'd take 6 to 8 students on spring break, and we'd do this HBCU tour and transfer to these HBCUs. And I remember going to Hampton and seeing the Emancipation Tree, and like right afterwards seeing a white Jesus at an HBCU church. And then next thing you know, you start to visit the museums, you start to find out there's quite a lot of HBCUs that were actually built by white people. So what Dr. Curry was talking about earlier in terms of this white savior complex, in terms of this, you know, tokenism, is so embedded, so institutionalized. And I can't just reflect, but Javon's earlier comment about this elitism, like some of these HBCUs, the groups that they created are so elitist, regurgitating white supremacist colonized ways of thinking and acting and doing and being, is deeply problematic. So part of it is assessing that something could be Black on the outside, but is it truly Black, you know, on the inside? Is it Black in its curriculum? Is it Black in its pedagogy? Is it Black in its liberation? And not to say that there isn't, like, there's phenomenal people that came out of these institutions that really, like Dr. Francis Crosby Welsing at Howard, and, you know, Booker T. Washington, you know, and George Washington Carver, and Martin Luther King, for sure, you know, produced some of these greatest, you know, W.B. Du Bois at Fisk. But at the same time, we're reckoning with that these are colonized spaces. And so they have to also decolonize. And I want to make this one last point that the sister Donna had, that both Tommy and Javon mentioned. Part of learning is just unlearning. That's enough. Like, just actively unlearn and interrogate and inquire your predispositions and assumptions of Black folk. Like, just start there. Like, why am I thinking this way? Why do I have a need to help? You know, as a Black man, my biggest fear in the world is a white woman. Like, that is my biggest fear. Like, I don't go into elevators alone. I think of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I don't go into an alley. If I see her, I'm walking back. I don't have a purse. I'm clutching myself. I have no shot with that jury. I have no shot with that system. That accusation is as good as gold. You know, I think of Emmett Till. I think of Central Park 5. I mean, so I have no choice as a Black man. And so I'm always cognizant. So you talk about fear, you know, so you have to understand, like, these Karens, these, you know, Amy Coopers, like, they understand the weaponization of their whiteness. And so when Tommy talks about the enemy piece, like, you have to understand that Black men, like, I have a policy. I don't meet with white women in my office alone. As a counselor, I don't. I keep the door open. I have someone else there. Like, these are concrete ways. So when Black men engage and you see this type of engagement, there's lived realities behind that. And so part of just learning itself is unlearning. And let's be comfortable.
Right.
Absolutely.
The lived realities that you talk about, but also the robust histories attached to that I think Tommy is talking about, right? So you mentioned Emmett Till and I forgot but then there's also but there's also the more recent bird watching case, right?
Yeah, that was the coup. Yeah.
Amy Cooper.
There's even Black Wall Street that began because a Black man bumped into a woman in an elevator in Tulsa, right? So there's both lived reality, blood memories, these long histories attached to it, right? So look, I'll take a slightly different approach than Tommy. I agree with everything you said about the white woman, maybe except for the fact that maybe it's that I want to believe in allyship, even though I've seen it fail over and over and over again, right? Maybe it's the want, maybe it's that I have seen it succeed in times, but it is hard work, right? It's whatever it is hard work to be there for someone and then for them to turn around and go, not right now. Like, you put in hours and they go, not right now. And you're like, but we're friends. And they're like, no, we're not. How do you continually work for someone like that? That's difficult. And I'm not going to sit here and lie and say as a human that isn't a difficult thing. It's a difficult engagement, right? It's actually why I think, what's her name from the Black white woman, the NAACP woman?
Dozon?
Rachel Dozon?
I honestly think she had to be, in her mind, she had to be Black because she didn't want to do that difficult work. It was easier for her to infiltrate than to do the difficult work of not being a true member, right? Whatever. But with that being said, like, it's hard. It is the unlearning that they both talked about. It is, and unlearning is a process over long periods of time. I think one of the things that we forget that history talks about things as if you go in a history class, they'll talk about a whole period as if it happened in an hour, and it doesn't generally function that way, right? Like, these things happen over decades, and it's gonna take you time. Look, I wish personally, I think Black folk wish white folk got it in one day, in an hour. I think I'm gonna go out on a limb to say that, but it does take time, and it's hard work, and you're gonna feel contradicted and frustrated and and whatever. Personally, I don't care when white people feel frustrated about doing race work. It just doesn't. It's like, okay.
I mean, we had to go through our frustrations to do the race work, to unpack being loving ourselves.
Not only frustrations, but the death that Dr. Bull was talking about, the death threats, right? The fact that white people try to announce me dead upon arrival. They try to announce me as strange cargo upon birth, right? And so I think about like that, like if we're sitting here triaging them, your frustration will not weigh as much. It won't even come close.
Sure. So listen, I would like to kind of like close out this beautiful panel with a beautiful question that I think we definitely need to be mindful of as well. And I want to thank you, Angela Kong, out there for putting this out there. You know, she writes, really appreciating this conversation, the insights and different experiences. How do you all on this panel practice self-care and stay centered with all the work that you have to do? Where is your Black boy joy? right? I see you out there, Jay, wearing that Black boy joy. And we've talked about this too. Like, where do we find joy? How do we practice self-care in this particular moment? And I'll let you, Tommy, since, you know, my brother's over here, kind of finish this out, take this one up first.
Wow. I mean, it's a difficult question, kind of given what I work on. I'm always in a fight with somebody about Black men, because it's never ending, right? Because you're fighting against your own people, you're fighting against white people. So I mean, one of the nice things about Scotland is that because you don't have the kind of overt hostility, you know, to Black men here, I feel like I've relaxed a lot. But mostly I spend time with my family, right? Like, you know, I'll just tell you this really quickly. I think one of the benefits and the curses of what I do is that sometimes, you know, because I founded Black Male Studies and really kind of pushed it, if anything else, is I get these letters from Black men sometimes where Black men will tell me that they were about to kill themselves. And this is one of the first letters that I received a few months after I published The Man Not. And his brother told me he was about to commit suicide, and he did a Google search for Black male vulnerability. And it was a copy left in Barnes and Noble, and he stayed up all night reading it, you know, and he thought differently about his suffering and pain. And I guess one of the things that is a curse is I always wonder whether or not that's a success, because if he didn't find it, or if he just didn't do that, he would be dead, right? And that's the kind of reality that works in the back of my head. And my wife told me, she's like, you know, because you're doing this and you are saving some and others aren't, you really have to start focusing on the positive. Because I think I'm a natural pessimist. I tend to look at all the Black men that we're losing because the world misunderstands them. And I think that looking at Black male life, right, looking at what Black men create, looking at how Black men endure, looking at like Black families and Black communities, that really changes my outlook. And I think that that's what allows me to really enjoy my family, to enjoy the fact that Black men are successful, to enjoy that we're having this kind of conversation, right? Like all that's part of care. It's part of how I'm changing the way that I view reality and how I'm taking time away from doing academic work to actually live life, right? I think that's a big thing for a lot of Black men that's in the academy, is that we know that we have to do so much more than every other group in the academy because we're the most underrepresented in many cases. And that burden, that John Henryism, where we work ourselves to death and we're trying to make sure that we communicate our experiences, but we do it this way and don't want to offend this person so that we're not threats. I think that weighs down on us. And I think a good part of that, of us interpreting that situation and knowing it's there, but also embracing kind of the sociality of what we created, be that from family, from colleagues, etc.
Thank you. Dr. Bull, how do you find joy?
You know, I find it in, for sure, family. You know, my wife and my daughter. It's a little bit difficult with COVID because, you know, my grandma has pre-existing conditions. And so, you know, it's difficult seeing family in these times. But, you know, for sure, just watching my daughter grow. I mean, I've been potty training on Zoom, you know, 8 months. She graduated from my coworker to my supervisor. You know what I mean? Like she promoted herself in these 8 months. That's been a joy. Also just being in community with like-minded, you know, Black liberation thought, like having these spaces. This right here is like, it's healing. This is like nourishment for my soul, my intellect, my spirit, you know, tapping in with people that are about liberating the Black cause is something that's, you know, this is one of the few places where actually get to put down our spears and weaponry and actually like rest and just talk. Because as Tommy mentioned, and Javon, like it's battle outside of this, right? But here, like we get to put our spears down. This is like camp. Like it's coming back to base camp before we go back to war. And that's what I'm saying. Like an ally can clock in and out. A co-conspirator, like you better be a spy, like infiltrating the enemy. Like you got some work to do. Mm-hmm. So these type of spaces that are curated are it's definitely self-work. I've been writing a lot, you know, published like almost 6 articles in the time period. And that's been therapeutic, just getting that out there. And lastly, these aha moments, you know, when certain communities, you know, read an article. I remember I did a training at Butte College, and Butte College is like up north, Paradise. I mean, it's like Central KKK, you know what I mean? And one of the participants' daughter contacted me on Twitter and said, my mom was the biggest like racist, bigot in the world. And her life just, your presentation, like she started to really think about how racist she was. And she would never admit that, would fight all the time. And so just this long, heartfelt message. I'm like, okay, there's people, like there's aha moments occurring. And we're gonna need those to really push along the agenda. Not rely on those, but we're gonna need those to actually move along the agenda. So I think it's, that's part of the self-care. And also eating right. Like I'm decolonizing my diet. You know what I mean? Like this stuff is killing us, y'all. You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to decolonize my diet. I can't go into the gym because people are crazy, but that's part of the process.
Well, don't go to the gym anyway, because COVID, just putting that out. Okay.
Yeah. They're not masking right.
Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, so you know me, Rach. First, I'm gonna take this in a wild about way if I can, because this is honestly Black Boy Joy is what I'm actually writing this next monograph about, and I'm kind of sort of middle of it. So I have a lot of trees. I don't understand the forest of it right now. So bear with me if I could use that metaphor. I have a poem about me being a violent boy when I grew up. I used to fight a lot, right? And it gets to this point. I mean, the poem talks about me fighting. I was like, I don't, the world has never really allowed me to unclench my fist. I talk about that time when we were in Mississippi, Rage. This is not the time when that evening, but I was walking down the street and a truck full of white guys, I say drunk off Confederate flags, called me a nigger. And I remember, instead of getting upset, I wanted to show them how much of a nigga I could be. And I remember balling my fist like, what's up then? Get out the car. Come on, man. Let's see what's happening, right? It's that destructive moment where I'm like, all right, well, let it all go to hell, right? And I talk about that. And but I then talk about all these violent things, and I go, when my niece tells me I'm the best uncle in the world, something I know she tells all of her uncles. She absolutely, I caught her like a few times. That person, good to know. But I still love her for telling me I am, right? Like I still buy it. I know it's not my fist, but the way they can bloom into flowers that makes her say this, right? My niece and my nephews know me as this silly, caring guy, not this guy who's on edge, just ready to break somebody wide open, right? And I say all of that to say, I think about poet Ross Gay's sort of discussion about joy. And he thinks about joy as not necessarily pleasure, though related to it, but forever attached to a sorrow. And he says in this piece, he thinks about it like parenting, the idea that our children brings us so much amazement, but it's forever attached to the threat of losing them. That terror is present, right? And he says this for him is joy. And I think about that. And he says in this piece, it's a very short piece, and I think a beautifully written piece, where he says one of the best things he's ever heard was one of his students when he asked his graduate course, what kind of pedagogues do they want to be? And his student says, I want to share wildernesses with my classrooms. And he was like, think about that for a second, that there's this unexplored territory of the human, and she wants to combine that, right? And I want to think about that and expand that out, that combined unexplored territory only happens in safety, right? In the putting down of the spears that Dr. Bull just mentioned, right? But how can you do that, right? And so I say all of that to say, right? I have community. I have friends and family I know that I could put down the spears and share the most unexplored parts of myself with. I know for a fact, Rach, if I'm dealing with something, I can call you up and be like, thanks. Right? I have my brother Rudy, who I call daily. I have other Black men, and Rudy and I are working on this collaborative project because one of the things, I was on the phone with him and I was like, bro, when is the last time a Black man that you're not related to said to you, I love you? And he went, shit. Maybe 3 months ago when you said it, and that was probably before that, maybe like a year. And I was like, yikes. And I was like, brother, I'm sorry, I love you, right? And I get off the phone with my Black male friend, I love you deeply and dearly, right? And I think about my ability to do that with him, that we begin interviewing so many other Black men who goes, I haven't heard it in like 2 years, 3 years, and I'm like, oh my God. But we know statistically Black men don't hear that, not only from other Black men, but also from Black women, from other folks as well. We know we don't hear it, right? And if we don't hear it, that causes a psychological problem. We know these things to be true, right? Whatever. I say all of that to say, I have friends and family that I could share the unexplored self, my unexplored self with, that I could be vulnerable with, that I could lose myself with. And I think about The Last Black Man in San Francisco, that film, often. And I think about the moment when Jimmy, Ma, and I'm forgetting the other character's name, hug at the end, and he simply says, "Thank you for being my best friend." That's it. We don't know if they're going to remain friends. We don't know anything. And for me, but the beauty of that movie is that they share wildernesses with each other. And for me, that's the joy, the ability to explore and be explored by someone, but to do so safely. And I say that to say I have that with family. I have that with friends. And that's what animates me mostly. It isn't necessarily the frustrations that animate me, though those animate me too. But it is also always what can be next, right? What else? Can this sense of this sense of heightened emotionality, this sense of heightened shared emotionality, can I create a world, even if it's only for a moment, between us here, right? Where I feel like I can share that part of myself and be completely joyous. And that sharing on a practical level looks like me cooking for you, right? Going to the herb garden and grabbing something and being proud, like, oh, that basil came out the backyard, taste on that, right? That's my joy. It's holding my newborn daughter. That's like that, right? Like that. It's being like when my mom was able to come out here and see that, right? Like I'm not so much animated by that other stuff, right? I'm animated by what makes us the most beautiful and amazing and caring persons of ourselves, right? But as I said backstage when we talked quickly yesterday, I pray for peace, but I do so with the same mouth I hide the razor blade in. So I want to always be that joyous. I want to always be the flower, the laughing, jokey guy my niece thinks I am. But this world has never allowed me to unclench my fist.
Well, let me end this session by telling each of you that I love you, that I appreciate you, that I honor you and your work, that I embrace you across, all of this virtual space that we have here. And I appreciate you sharing your vulnerable stories and your very real truth with this particular audience who stayed with us the entire time. So to my NCHEA audience out there, we do have another session that's coming up in about 40 minutes, and it will take you through a mindful way of addressing the U.S. history about race and racism. So I welcome you back in about 40 minutes. And at this point, we're going to say goodbye to you. See you later, my friend.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Doc.